Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The forest floor was cold against her skin, the scent of damp earth and crushed pine needles filling her lungs. It was always the same. Darkness, thick and suffocating, clung to the ancient trees like a shroud. A low growl rumbled through the ground, vibrating in the hollow of her bones, a sound more felt than heard. Then, the eyes appeared, two molten gold discs burning through the shadows, pinning her where she lay. They were filled with a hunger so profound, so timeless, it felt like staring into the heart of a dying star. A voice, rough as splintered bone yet laced with a desperate sorrow, whispered her name on the wind. Raina. The dream was a cage, and every night, the wolf inside it drew closer to the bars. Tonight, she could feel its hot breath on her face, a promise of violence and a plea for salvation. Raina jolted awake, tangled in sweat-dampened sheets, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of pine lingered, impossibly real, clinging to the air in her small cottage bedroom. Outside, a sliver of the moon, a predatory, crimson-tinged crescent, hung in the ink-black sky. The blood moon was rising, and a primal part of her she refused to acknowledge knew it was not just a celestial event. It was an appointment. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet as she padded to the kitchen, her movements stiff with exhaustion. For 20 years, she had lived this quiet, solitary life on the edge of the Blackwood, the sprawling, myth-haunted forest that bordered their sleepy town of Stillwater. She was the strange girl in the cottage her parents had left her, the one with shadows under her eyes who kept to herself, who seemed to flinch from loud noises and bright lights. The townspeople were kind in a distant, cautious way, as if they sensed something broken in her they didn't wish to disturb. They didn't know the truth, that her mind was a battlefield, and every night she lost. She lit the gas stove with a trembling hand, the hiss and bloom of the blue flame a small comfort in the oppressive silence. The dreams had started as whispers, fragments of fang and fur, a disembodied sense of being hunted. But over the last year, they had sharpened, solidified. The wolf was no longer a phantom, but a presence, his golden eyes filled with a terrifying, agonizing recognition. He looked at her as if she were a memory he was trying to reclaim, a ghost he was desperate to make solid. Raina poured hot water over dried chamomile flowers, the steam warming her cold face. She had tried everything. Doctors in the city who prescribed pills that dulled her senses but not the dreams. A village wise woman who had burned sage and muttered prayers, her eyes full of pity. Nothing worked. The wolf was a part of her, a splinter of madness lodged so deep in her soul she feared pulling it out would unravel her completely. As she sipped the tea, her gaze drifted to the window. The blood moon was fuller now, casting a feverish, rust-colored light over the world. The trees of the Blackwood seemed to lean closer, their branches like skeletal fingers scratching at the sky. A local legend, one she'd always dismissed as foolish folklore, echoed in her mind. They said on the night of the blood moon, the veil between worlds thinned. They said the old things, the wild things, walked freely. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down her spine. She drew the curtains shut, but it was useless. She could feel the moon's pull in her blood, a strange, frantic hum that made her skin itch and her muscles ache with a phantom restlessness. It felt like a song she had forgotten the words to, a dance she no longer knew the steps for. Deciding sleep was a battle she would not fight tonight, she retreated to her small living room. The space was filled with books, their spines cracked and worn, her only real companions. But even the familiar weight of a novel in her hands couldn't anchor her. The air was too heavy, charged, with an electric anticipation. The very silence of the cottage seemed to be holding its breath. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Raina froze, the teacup rattling in its saucer. Her cottage was old. It settled and groaned with the wind. It was nothing, but the sound had been different, deliberate. A weight settling. She held her breath, straining her ears, every nerve ending alight. The only sound was the frantic thumping of her own heart. "It's the lack of sleep," she told herself, her voice a raw whisper in the stillness. "You're imagining things." She forced herself to take a slow, deep breath, but the scent of pine was stronger now, mixed with something else. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, and a dark, musky scent that was entirely masculine and utterly feral. It was the scent from her dream. Panic, cold and suffocating, seized her. She backed away from the staircase, her eyes wide and fixed on the shadows pooling at the top. This wasn't a dream. She was awake. She was wide awake, and the dream had followed her out. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a tremor. Silence answered her. A profound, predatory silence that was worse than any noise. It was the silence of a hunter that knows its prey is cornered. Then, a low sound drifted down from the landing. Not a growl. Not this time. It was a sigh. A sound of immense weariness. Of a pain so ancient it seemed to have been carved from the bedrock of the world. It was a human sound, and that was infinitely more terrifying. Slowly, a figure detached itself from the shadows. Raina's breath hitched in her throat, a strangled, helpless sound. He was impossibly large, his frame so broad it seemed to fill the entire hallway. He descended the stairs not with the heavy tread of a man his size, but with the fluid, unnerving grace of a great cat. The bloody moonlight from the window behind him cast him in silhouette, a specter of raw power and barely contained violence. As he reached the bottom step and moved into the dim lamplight of the living room, her mind simply refused to process what she was seeing. He wasn't just a man. He was the legend she'd heard whispered in frightened tones by the old-timers in the village pub, the Alpha King. His face was a harsh landscape of sharp angles and old sorrows, framed by a mane of raven-black hair that fell past his shoulders. A jagged scar cut from his left temple down across his cheekbone, a silvered reminder of a battle long past. But it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. They were the eyes from her dream, molten gold, intelligent, and blazing with an emotion she couldn't name, a devastating mix of fury, grief, and a desperate, soul-deep longing that was aimed directly at her. He wore simple, dark clothing that did nothing to hide the sheer muscularity of his form. He was a creature built for war, for the hunt, for survival. He was the apex predator from her nightmares, made flesh and blood and standing in her home. Raina scrambled backward, her hip hitting the edge of a small table and sending a stack of books crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the charged silence. The man the king didn't even flinch. His golden eyes tracked her every move, burning with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "You," he said, and his voice was the same one from the dream, a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into her soul. It was a voice accustomed to command, to being obeyed without question, but now it was raw, cracked with a century of searching. "It's you." Raina shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. I don't know you. Get out of my house." The words were pathetic, a mouse squeaking at a lion. A flicker of something pain, confusion crossed his harsh features. He took a step closer, and the air around him seemed to crackle with power. The scent of him was overwhelming now. Pine and storm and wild earth, and it was doing something strange to her, waking up that frantic, humming thing in her blood. "You do not remember," he stated, not a question but a confirmation of his worst fear. He stopped a few feet away, his massive frame radiating a heat she could feel even from a distance. "The scent is the same. The face, your face is the same. But the eyes, they are empty of me." He was insane. He had to be. A madman who had broken into her home, spouting nonsense. But her body betrayed her. It wasn't screaming in terror. It was listening, leaning toward him, drawn by an invisible thread. The wolf inside her, the one she fought every night, was stirring, not with fear, but with a shocking, terrifying recognition. "Please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Leave me alone." He looked at her then, and for a fleeting second, the terrifying king was gone, replaced by a man drowning in a grief so vast it threatened to consume them both. "I cannot," he said, his voice dropping to a guttural murmur. "I have searched for you across lifetimes. Through wars and plagues and the slow, grinding death of ages, I will not lose you again." He moved before she could react. In one fluid, impossibly fast motion, he closed the distance between them. Raina cried out, stumbling back, but his hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was like iron, yet there was a strange reverence in his touch. It didn't hurt. It burned. A searing heat flooded her veins, a jolt of pure energy that made her gasp. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never known. His calloused thumb stroked over the delicate skin of her inner wrist, right over her frantic pulse. His golden eyes stared down into hers, and she saw galaxies of pain swirling in their depths. He was searching for something, for some flicker of the woman he thought she was. "You are not human, Raina," he murmured, his breath ghosting across her cheek, smelling of the wild night. "You were never human. They hid you. They made you forget." He lowered his head, his gaze dropping from her eyes to her throat, and a low, possessive growl rumbled in his chest. It was the sound from her dream, the sound of the wolf claiming its territory, the sound of a king finding his lost queen. His grip tightened on her wrist, pulling her inexorably closer until her body was flush against his hard frame. She could feel the thunder of his heart against her own, two frantic drums beating a rhythm that was both terrifying and achingly familiar. "The dream is over," he growled, his voice a silken threat that promised to shatter her world. "Now, you wake up." His words were a lit match thrown into the tinder-dry kindling of her reality. "Now, you wake up." For a frozen moment, all Raina could do was stare into the inferno of his golden eyes, the world she knew turning to ash around her. Then, the survival instinct she'd honed through a lifetime of being small and quiet screamed to life. She shoved against his chest with all her might, a desperate, futile gesture. It was like pushing against a mountain. He didn't even sway. "Let go of me," she hissed, the words torn from her throat. She twisted her wrist, but his grip was absolute, a manacle of warm, living steel. The frantic energy thrumming through her veins was no longer just fear. It was a wild, unfamiliar fury. "You're insane. I am Maron Valère," he cut in, his voice a low growl that silenced her protest. He pulled her closer still, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The scar on his face seemed to tighten, a testament to old violence. "And you are mine. You have always been mine. That is the only truth that matters now." His certainty was terrifying. It was an ancient, unshakable conviction that left no room for her own will, her own life. He began to move, pulling her toward the open doorway of her cottage, out into the blood-soaked night. Raina dug her heels in, her bare feet scraping against the worn wooden floor. "No, this is my home. You can't just—" He didn't even look at her. With an air of weary impatience, he simply scooped her into his arms. The world tilted violently. One arm clamped around her back, the other hooked beneath her knees, and suddenly she was airborne, held fast against his unyielding chest. A choked cry of shock and outrage died in her throat. He was so strong it was unnatural. The sheer power radiating from him was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing her breath. She was nothing to him, a doll to be carried away. He strode out of her cottage without a backward glance, leaving the door gaping open to the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, shocking the heat from her skin. The crimson moonlight painted the familiar clearing in nightmarish hues. The world felt wrong, tilted on its axis. As he stepped onto the path leading into the blackwood, Raina renewed her struggle, kicking and writhing in. His hold. "Put me down. Someone will hear. They'll call the police." A dry, humorless sound escaped him, more a snort of contempt than a laugh. "Let them come. Let their tin machines and their loud little weapons face the king of the Blackwood in his own domain on the night of the blood moon. It would be a short battle." The casual, absolute arrogance of his words chilled her more than the night air. He wasn't threatening her. He was stating a fact. He stepped off the path and into the trees, and the darkness of the forest swallowed them whole. The familiar woods of her childhood transformed into a hostile, alien landscape. The branches of ancient oaks and pines clawed at them, but seemed to part for him, as if the forest itself bent to his will. He moved through the tangled undergrowth with a silent, preternatural swiftness, never stumbling, his feet making almost no sound on the leaf-strewn ground. Raina fell still, the futility of her fight crashing down on her. Her struggles were meaningless against his strength. Her threats were empty. All she could do was watch as her life, her small, quiet, predictable life, vanished behind them with every step he took. Her heart ached with a sudden, sharp grief. The cottage, the books, the town, the very idea of being human, it was all being stolen from her. The scent of him was all-encompassing, a dizzying mix of pine, night air, and something else, something wild and musky that spoke of wolf. It seeped into her skin, into her lungs. and instead of repulsing her, it was having the opposite effect. The frantic humming in her blood was settling into a deeper, slower rhythm, as if sinking to the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear. The wolf in her dreams, the one she'd always fought, was uncoiling in the depths of her soul, not with a snarl of fear, but with a low purr of recognition. It was a horrifying, seductive feeling. "Where are you taking me?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. He didn't answer for a long time, his golden eyes fixed on the path ahead, which was no path at all, but a trail only he could see. The moonlight dappled through the canopy, painting fleeting, bloody patterns across his harsh features. "Home," he said at last, the word a rough caress. "To our home. Stillwater is my home. Stillwater is the cage they built for you," he countered, his tone hardening. "A cage of false memories and thin, human weakness. They dulled your senses, muted your spirit. They tried to erase what you are, what we are." He looked down at her then, and the raw agony in his gaze was so profound it made her flinch. Did they take everything? Is there truly nothing of her left in you? Her? Who was her? Raina stared at him, bewildered. "I don't know what you're talking about." A muscle clenched in his jaw. "Your scent," he murmured, his voice dropping low, almost to himself. "For 200 years, it was a ghost on air. The wind. A memory I could never quite catch. I would find a trace of it on a forgotten battlefield, in the heart of a dying city, near a windswept coastline. Always a step behind, always too late. But tonight your scent bloomed under the blood moon like a beacon. It called me, it screamed your name across the veil." He was mad, beautiful and terrifying and utterly, tragically mad, and he had dragged her into his delusion. Yet, a part of her listened, captivated. A part of her felt the ring of an ancient, buried truth in his words. She had to try one last time to appeal to reason. "My name is Raina Solon. My parents were human. I was born in the hospital in the next town over. I have a birth certificate. I am human." He stopped then, so abruptly she jolted in his arms. He stood in a small clearing where the moonlight poured down, bathing them in its eerie red glow. He slowly, deliberately, lowered her to her feet, though he kept his hands firmly on her upper arms, holding her in place. The forest was utterly silent around them. No crickets, no rustling of nocturnal creatures. It was as if all the life in the woods was holding its breath, cowering in the presence of its master. "Solon," he repeated, tasting the name with a sort of clinical disdain. "A human name they gave you. A lie to anchor you to their world." He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, forcing her to meet his burning gaze. "Close your eyes, Raina." "No, close them," he commanded, his voice soft but laced with steel. "Breathe. And for once in your life, stop listening to the frightened girl in your head and listen to the truth in your blood." "What do you smell?" Her first instinct was to refuse, to defy him, but his proximity was overwhelming, his power a tangible thing that seemed to press all the air from her lungs. Trembling, she closed her eyes. The darkness behind her lids was a relief. She took a shaky breath, then another, forcing herself to focus past the immediate scent of him. She smelled the damp earth, rich and loamy, the sharp, clean scent of pine, the decaying sweetness of wet leaves. "I smell the forest," she said, her voice tight. "Deeper," he urged, his voice a hypnotic whisper beside her ear. "Forget what you think a forest smells like. What is truly there?" She did as he asked, pushing her senses further than she ever had before. And then she found it. Underneath the obvious scents, there were layers. The faint, coppery tang of a rabbit's fear from an hour ago, the musky trail of a fox that had passed through this clearing, the subtle difference between the scent of an oak tree and a birch, and beneath it all, something else. A network of scents, of trails, of lives lived and ended. It was a language she suddenly, inexplicably, understood. Her eyes flew open, wide with shock. "How?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a sad, triumphant thing. "That is only the beginning. They couldn't take it all from you. The blood runs too deep." He released one of her arms and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "The one I lost." She could read the stories of the forest for 100 years in a single breath. She knew the language of the wind and the secrets of the stones. She was the wild-made flesh, and her heart beat in time with mine. His smile faded, replaced by that crushing sorrow. And I failed her. I let them take her from me. The raw emotion in his voice, the sheer weight of his guilt and grief, resonated within her. She felt an echo of his pain in her own chest, a phantom ache for a loss she couldn't remember. For the first time, she saw past the terrifying Alpha King and saw the broken male beneath, the one who had searched for centuries. Without thinking, she raised her hand and her fingers brushed against the scar on his cheek. He froze at her touch, his entire body going rigid. His golden eyes widened, a storm of emotion, shock, hope, disbelief, swirling in their depths. A low growl rumbled in his chest, but it wasn't threatening. It was wounded, pleading. "You remember," he breathed, his voice rough with unshed tears. The moment was shattered by a sound in the distance. A long, mournful howl that rose and fell, answered by another, closer this time. The sound vibrated in Reyna's bones, and the wolf inside her stirred, lifting its head, its ears pricked. It was a call, a summons. Marin's expression hardened, the moment of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had appeared. He pulled his face away from her touch, his mask of command slamming back into place. He swept her back into his arms and began moving again, faster this time, his long legs eating up the ground. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. The trees grew older, larger, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the moon. They moved in near total darkness, yet he never faltered. Soon, Reyna began to feel it. A change in the air, a thrum of energy, of power, emanating from somewhere ahead. The scent of wood smoke reached her, and beneath it, the scent of dozens of others like him. The same wild, musky scent, 100 different variations of it. His pack. They broke through a final line of ancient yews and into a vast, hidden valley. Reyna's breath caught in her throat. Nestled in the center of the valley, carved into the side of a granite cliff face, was a fortress. It wasn't a castle of towers and pennants, but something far older, more primal. It was a keep of black stone that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself, its walls scarred and weathered by millennia. Torches flickered in its narrow windows, casting long, dancing shadows. Figures moved in the torchlight below. Tall, powerful forms, both men and women. As Maron approached, they turned as one. And Reyna saw, their eyes, in the flickering light, they glowed. Amber, silver, green, and gold. The eyes of predators, the eyes of wolves. He strode into their midst and they parted for him, heads bowed in deference. But their eyes, all of them, were fixed on her, on the human girl in their king's arms. Whispers erupted, a low, sibilant hiss of sound. Growls rumbled in their chests. She could feel their shock, their suspicion, their hostility, like a physical wave. Maron ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the great stone entrance to the keep. He stopped before the threshold and set her on her feet, his hand a possessive brand on the small of her back, keeping her pinned to his side. A man stepped forward from the crowd. He was nearly as large as Maron, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw and eyes of cold, pale silver. A network of scars covered his face and neck, and he carried himself with an authority second only to the king's. "My king," the man said, his voice a low gravel. He bowed his head slightly, but his silver eyes were locked on Reyna, filled with a dangerous, challenging light. "You return. But what is this?" He practically spat the last word, his nostrils flaring in disgust. "You bring the stench of humanity into the heart of our sanctuary. Has the long search finally driven you mad?" The pack murmured in agreement, a low chorus of growls. The air grew thick with tension, heavy with the promise of violence. Maron didn't even look at the silver-eyed man. His golden gaze swept over the assembled pack, a silent assertion of his absolute authority. The murmuring died instantly. He then looked down at Reyna, and his hand tightened on her back, pulling her even closer until her shoulder was pressed against his chest. He lifted his head, his voice ringing out in the sudden, sharp silence, a king's decree that echoed off the ancient stones. "She is not human," he declared, his voice raw with a possessiveness that was absolute, a claim that defied heaven and hell. "She is your queen." The king's declaration fell into a chasm of absolute silence. "She is your queen." The words did not echo. They were swallowed by the sudden, suffocating stillness of the valley. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then, the silence fractured. It did not break with a shout, but with a low, collective, guttural snarl that rose from the chests of the assembled pack. It was the sound of 100 predators questioning the judgment of their alpha, a sound of profound, instinctual dissent. The silver-eyed wolf, the one who had first challenged him, took a half-step forward. His lips were peeled back from his teeth, a clear display of aggression. "My king," he began, his voice dangerously soft. "You have been alone for too long. Your grief has become a sickness. This thing." He waved a dismissive hand toward Reyna, his eyes burning with contempt. "She reeks of human weakness. There is no wolf in her, no fire. She is an empty vessel. She cannot be our queen." A chorus of growls rumbled in agreement. The hostility in the air was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that made Reyna's lungs ache. They were all looking at her now, their glowing eyes filled with a mix of pity and disgust. They saw her as he did, a contamination, a flaw in their perfect primal world. She was a stray dog brought into a den of wolves, and they were ready to tear her apart. Her hand, of its own accord, gripped the fabric of Mehron's tunic, her knuckles white. Mehron did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply tilted his head, a slow, deliberate motion, and fixed his molten gold eyes on the silver-eyed wolf. He let the wave of dissent wash over him, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Vorlag," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm rumble that cut through the pack's aggression like a blade. "You are my beta, my second. You, of all wolves, should remember your place." Vorlag's jaw clenched. "My place is to protect this pack, to protect you from a madness born of a ghost's memory." "Then protect them," Mehron replied, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a resonant, powerful quality that vibrated in Reyna's bones. "By kneeling." It was not a request. It was an unwrapping of power, a command that bypassed reason and struck straight at the primal core of their beings. A wave of pure, unadulterated dominance rolled off him. The air crackled. The torches seemed to dim as if starved of oxygen. Reyna gasped, feeling the weight of it press down on her, a dizzying, terrifying force. But it wasn't aimed at her. Through her it sought the pack. For a moment, Vorlag fought it. His body went rigid, his muscles bunching as he battled the sheer force of his alpha's will. A choked snarl was ripped from his throat. His silver eyes blazed with defiance. But it was a battle he could not win. With a final, ragged gasp, his resistance shattered. His knees buckled, and he crashed to the ground, his head bowed, his body trembling with the effort of his submission. And like a ripple spreading through water, the rest of the pack followed. One by one, then in dozens, they fell to their knees, their heads bowed to their king. The snarling ceased, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing and the wet scrape of boots on stone. In the space of a heartbeat, a mutinous mob had been forced into absolute fealty. Reyna stared, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified, yet a part of her, the deep, sleeping wolf he spoke of, was in awe. This was power. Not the fleeting political power of human kings, but a fundamental, living force of nature. He was the center of their universe, and his will was gravity, and he had just bent that universe to protect her. His hand on her back was still a brand of heat. Without another word to his kneeling pack, he guided her forward, through the parted ranks of wolves, toward the great stone maw of the keep. Their eyes followed her, no longer openly hostile, but now filled with a bewildered, fearful respect. She was the creature their infallible king had knelt them for. It made her more dangerous, more of an enigma than simple humanity ever could. The moment they passed the threshold, the warmth of the keep enveloped them. The air inside was thick with the scent of old stone, wood smoke, roasting meat, and the overwhelming, layered scent of the pack. Great tapestries depicting epic hunts and forgotten battles hung on the stone walls, their colors faded by time. Torches in iron sconces cast flickering, monstrous shadows that danced like ghosts in her peripheral vision. This place was ancient, alive with history and violence. Mehron didn't stop. He pulled her along, his long strides forcing her into a half-jog to keep up. They passed through a great hall, where a massive fire roared in a hearth big enough to roast an ox. More shifters were gathered there, their conversations dying as they saw her, their eyes widening in shock. Mehron ignored them all, his focus solely on a massive stone staircase that curved up into the darkness. He led her up the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The air grew cooler, quieter. They were moving away from the heart of the pack, into the more private section of the keep, the king's domain. He finally stopped before a set of huge, iron-bound wooden doors and pushed them open. He led her inside and let the doors swing shut behind them, the heavy boom echoing the closing of a tomb. The room was vast, a space of shadows and moonlight. A huge, unlit hearth dominated one wall. Furs were piled on the floor and draped over heavy, carved wooden furniture. A massive bed, big enough for 4 men, sat on a raised dais against the far wall, its posts carved to resemble snarling wolves. A single, arched window, unglazed and open to the night, allowed the crimson light of the blood moon to spill across the floor. Mayron finally released her. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely cold and unmoored. She stumbled back a step, wrapping her arms around herself, a fragile human thing in a predator's lair. Now that they were alone, the questions and the fear she had suppressed came roaring back. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "Why would you do that? Humiliate your own people for me? They hate me. I can feel it. I don't belong here." He walked past her to the open window, his back to her as he stared out at the moonlit valley. The moonlight caught the silver threads in his hair, the powerful lines of his shoulders. "They do not hate you," he said, his voice weary. "They fear what they do not understand, and they fear for me. They think I am chasing a memory that will destroy us all." "And aren't you?" she shot back, taking a hesitant step closer. "You keep talking about her, the one you lost. I am not her. I am Raina Solon. I had a life, a small, quiet life, and you tore it apart for a ghost." He turned from the window, and the raw pain in his eyes silenced her. The king was gone again, leaving only the grieving male. "Her name was Lyra," he said, his voice soft and rough with memory. "And she was not a ghost. She was the sun and the moon and the heart of these mountains. She was my mate, my other half. And her soul is the same one that looks at me through your eyes, even if you cannot remember." He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping just before her. He was so close she had to crane her neck to look up at him, close enough to see the flicker of the distant torches reflected in his golden eyes. 200 years ago, he began, his voice a low, haunted whisper. "There was a war. Humans, grown bold with their iron and their faith, sought to eradicate us. They called us demons, monsters. They hunted us with silver and with fire. We were stronger, faster. But they were many. And they were clever. They forged an alliance with a coven of witches, beings who could weave magic that could harm even us." He paused, a shadow passing over his face. "Lyra was captured. Not in battle. Through trickery. A poison that did not kill, but untethered the soul from the wolf. They performed a ritual under a blood moon, just like this one. They sought to destroy her, to rip the queen soul from the world forever. But they failed. They did not destroy it. They fractured it. They cast it out, cursed it to be reborn, time and again, into the human world, to be born weak, wolfless, and mortal, to live a short, meaningless life, and die, only to be reborn again, never remembering, never returning home." Raina stared at him, her mind reeling. It was the stuff of dark fairy tales, of mad legends. It couldn't be real, and I was too late to stop them. He finished, his voice breaking on the last words. The guilt he carried was a palpable thing, a weight that seemed to bend the very air around him. "I found the clearing only after they were gone. All that was left was her scent, and the silver dagger they used in the ritual." His eyes flickered to the stone mantle above the hearth. Raina's gaze followed his. There, gleaming in the faint moonlight, lay a dagger. It was ornate, its hilt woven with silver wire, its blade long and cruelly sharp. It looked ancient, and it radiated a faint, cold malice. As her eyes fixed on it, the world tilted. The room dissolved. A wave of vertigo so profound it buckled her knees swept over her. She saw not the stone room, but a clearing in a forest. She smelled not wood smoke, but blood and ozone, and the cloying scent of dark magic. Her hand was small, and in it she held the silver dagger. Below her, a man lay on the ground, his chest soaked with blood, and as he looked up at her, his golden eyes, the same molten gold as Mayron's, were not filled with love, but with a horrifying, soul-shattering betrayal. Raina screamed, a thin, sharp sound of pure terror, and clutched her head as the vision shattered, leaving behind a blinding, searing pain. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed, the darkness rushing up to claim her. But she didn't hit the floor. Maron caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her as he lowered them both to their knees. He held her against his chest, her name a desperate, ragged prayer on his lips. Raina. Raina, what is it? What did you see? She was trembling uncontrollably, cold sweat beading on her forehead. The after-image of the vision was burned behind her eyelids. The dagger, the blood, and those betrayed, golden eyes. You, she gasped, looking up at him, her eyes wide with a new, deeper horror. It was you, in the dream, the memory. I was the one who stabbed you. Maron froze, his arms tightening around her like iron bands. The warmth of his body, which had been a strange comfort, now felt like the bars of a cage. His golden eyes, which had been filled with a desperate hope, now flared with a stark, raw shock that was quickly shuttered behind a wall of ancient ice. The king was back, his face a mask of impenetrable stone. But she had seen the flicker of agony. Her words had struck him like a physical blow. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low, each word a chip of granite. Raina couldn't breathe. The vision, the memory, whatever it was, clung to her like a shroud. The phantom weight of the silver dagger in her hand, the slick feel of a hilt soaked in warm blood, the look of utter devastation on his face as she drove the blade home. It was more real, more visceral, than any memory of her own 20 years of life. "I saw it," she whispered, her voice cracking. She pushed against his chest, a futile attempt to put space between them, to escape the suffocating intensity of his gaze. He didn't let her go. "A clearing, the blood moon. I had the dagger, and you were on the ground. I killed you." The last words were a choked sob, a confession to a crime she didn't understand. The horror of it was a living thing, clawing at her throat. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stared down at her, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly racing behind the impassive facade. The silence in the vast stone room was absolute, broken only by her ragged breathing and the distant crackle of the great fire in the hall below. He was studying her, searching her face, her eyes, for the lie, for the madness, and he was finding neither. Finally he spoke, his voice strained, rough. "That is not possible. You were not there." He said it with the force of a man trying to convince himself, to hold back a tide of impossible truth. "Lyra was taken. I was fighting on the northern ridge, holding back the human army. When I broke through their lines, when I finally reached the clearing, she was gone. The witches were gone. There was only silence. But I saw it," she insisted, her hysteria rising. "I felt it. It was my hand holding the knife." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate negation. "No, it's the curse. It's twisting the memories. The witches were masters of illusion, of deceit. They are trying to poison your mind against me, even from beyond the grave." He was explaining it away, rationalizing it, because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. But Raina had felt the truth of the vision in her bones, the cold intent, the grim satisfaction, the shattering heartbreak that followed. It was her memory. He gently, but firmly, pulled her to her feet, his hands still gripping her upper arms as if afraid she might shatter or flee. He guided her toward one of the heavy, fur-draped chairs near the cold hearth and pressed her down into it. He knelt before her, his large frame a dark silhouette against the moonlight, his golden eyes burning with a new, frantic urgency. "Raina, listen to me," he said, his voice softer now, persuasive. "The soul remembers trauma, and the magic they used on Lyra was a trauma beyond imagining. The memory you saw, it could be what they did. Perhaps one of them took on your form to strike the final blow. It would be their kind of cruelty. They did not just want to kill us. They wanted to defile everything we were." His explanation was logical. It was plausible. It offered her an escape from the horror of being a murderer, a betrayer. She wanted to believe him. Desperately, she wanted to believe him. But the feeling, the memory felt too personal, too intimate. It was not the memory of watching a stranger act. It was the memory of acting. She looked away from him, her gaze falling on her own hands, lying trembling in her lap. They were slender, pale, human hands. Not the hands of a killer. Not the hands of a queen. "I don't know what to believe," she whispered. "Everything I thought was real is gone. And everything you're telling me feels like a nightmare." A deep sigh escaped him, a sound of profound, centuries-old weariness. I know. I have ripped you from your world and thrown you into mine with no warning. Forgive me for that, but there was no time. The blood moon weakens the curse's hold. It is the only time the memories can begin to surface. It is the only time you can begin to heal. He reached out and took her hand. His was large and calloused, scarred from 100 battles, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. The same searing heat from before flooded her veins, a jolt of liquid fire that chased away some of the chilling dread. It was a terrifying, addictive sensation, a feeling of connection so powerful it bypassed her conscious mind entirely. "Your hands are cold," he murmured, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. He brought her hand to his lips and breathed a puff of warm air onto her skin. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender, so intimate, that it sent a shiver racing down her spine. In all her life, Lyra's hands were never cold. They burned with the fire of the mountains. He was comparing her again, always comparing her to the ghost of the perfect queen she could never be. A spark of anger, hot and sharp, cut through her fear and confusion. She snatched her hand back as if burned. "Stop it," she said, her voice low and tight. "Stop looking at me and seeing her. I am not Lyra." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of the Alpha's dangerous authority returning. You are. You are the vessel of her soul, whether you accept it or not. The fire is still in you. It is just sleeping, buried under 20 years of humanity. Then let it sleep," she cried, jumping to her feet and backing away from him. She paced the length of the room like a caged animal, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. "I don't want this. I don't want your memories or your war or your crown. I want my cottage. I want my books. I want to be left alone." "You were never alone," he roared, rising to his full, intimidating height. The sound of his voice, filled with a sudden, violent frustration, bounced off the stone walls. "You were dying, slowly, piece by piece. Don't you understand? A wolf soul cannot survive in a human body indefinitely. It tears itself apart. The dreams, the exhaustion, the feeling of being haunted. That was her, trying to break free before your mortal shell gave out completely." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. The constant fatigue that had plagued her for years, the shadows under her eyes that never faded, the strange aches in her bones, the feeling of being disconnected from her own skin. She had thought it was depression, an ailment of the mind. But what if it was, as he claimed, a sickness of the soul? "They told me, the doctors, they said it was anxiety," she stammered, clinging to the last vestiges of her rational world. "They are human. They diagnose human frailties," he said with contempt. "They cannot see the war being waged inside you. Another decade, maybe 2, and your body would have failed. Your soul would have been cast out again, into another cage, and my search would have begun anew. I found you just in time." He saw the flicker of doubt, of horrified understanding, in her eyes. He pressed his advantage, his voice softening again, becoming a low, seductive murmur. He walked toward her, slowly, giving her no room to escape. "But we can fix it," he said, stopping before her. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending another chaotic jolt through her system. "We can reawaken the wolf. We can make you whole again, strong, immortal, the queen you were born to be." Her heart was pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. Everything in her screamed to run, to deny him, but the wolf inside her, the one that had been a phantom tormentor for so long, was stirring with a strange, fierce longing. It heard his words not as a threat, but as a promise of freedom, of power, of belonging. How? The word was a bare whisper, a surrender. A slow, predatory smile touched his lips. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it was a terrifyingly beautiful sight. It transformed his harsh features, hinting at the charismatic, powerful king he must have been before grief had carved him into a monument of sorrow. "There are rituals, old magic, ways to call the wolf from its slumber," he explained. "But the most powerful way, the truest way, is the mate bond." He leaned in closer, his hot breath ghosting across her lips. The scent of him, pine and storm and feral masculinity, was an intoxicating poison. When a true mate is claimed, their souls join. My strength would become your strength. My wolf would call to yours, until it had no choice but to answer. The bond would heal the damage the witches did. It would burn away the last of the human weakness and forge you anew in the fire of our joining, claimed, joining. The words were primal, possessive, leaving no doubt as to their meaning. He was talking about something far more intimate than a ritual. He was talking about a complete and utter consumption of her being into his. Her mind recoiled in panic, but her body betrayed her. It swayed toward him, drawn by the raw magnetism of his power, the undeniable pull of the bond he spoke of. The humming in her blood was now a roaring current, and a strange, aching heat was pooling low in her belly. His golden eyes dropped to her mouth, and his gaze was a brand. I have been without you for 2 centuries, Reyna. A king without his queen, a wolf without his mate, an eternity of cold nights and silent halls. I will not wait any longer. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. Every nerve ending in her body screamed with a terrifying, exhilarating anticipation. This was the moment her world truly ended, and his began. Her past, her humanity, her very identity would be incinerated in the touch of his lips. But just as he lowered his head, the heavy doors to the chamber were thrown open with a crash. Vorlag, the silver-eyed beta, stood framed in the doorway, his face pale, his breathing ragged. 2 other wolves stood behind him, their expressions grim. "My king!" Vorlag gasped, his usual defiance replaced by genuine alarm. "Hunters, on the eastern ridge, a dozen of them, armed with silver." Mehran straightened instantly, the moment of intimacy shattered. He whirled to face his beta, the shift from grieving lover to warrior king so swift it gave Reyna whiplash. The air in the room grew cold, sharp with menace. How did they get past the wards? Mehran's voice was a low, deadly snarl. "We don't know," Vorlag admitted, his jaw tight. They moved like ghosts, silent, unseen until they were almost upon the sentries. "It's the Argent Hand. It has to be." At the name, a palpable wave of fear and hatred washed through the room. Even Reyna, who didn't understand, felt the chill of it. Mehran's eyes narrowed to slits of gold. He looked from Vorlag back to Reyna, a new, cold calculation in his gaze. The hunters were a threat, but she was the reason he was here, the reason he had a future to fight for. "Bar the gates," he commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Double the sentries on the western wall. I want every warrior armed and ready. Vorlag, you have command of the keep's defense." Vorlag nodded sharply, but then hesitated. "And you, my king?" Mehran's gaze swept back to Reyna, pinning her in place. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips once more, but this time it held no warmth. It was the smile of a predator cornered, a king about to unleash the full, terrifying force of his power. "The queen is unprotected," he said, his voice a silken promise of violence. "I will not leave her side. Let the hunters come. Let them break themselves upon these walls. Tonight, they will learn what it means to trespass in my kingdom and threaten what is mine." Vorlag stared, his silver eyes wide with disbelief. The words hung in the air, a blatant dereliction of a king's duty in the face of an imminent threat. "You will not lead the defense?" he asked, his voice a low, incredulous growl. "The Argent Hand is at our gates, and you will stay." "With her?" The contempt in his voice was a razor's edge. He did not see a queen to be protected. He saw a liability, a human distraction that was already costing them dearly. The 2 warriors behind him shifted, their hands clenching into fists, their glowing eyes reflecting their beta's outrage. The pack's loyalty was to their king, but their instinct was for survival, and Mehran's decision felt like madness. Mehran turned his head slowly, the motion deliberate and filled with a chilling lack of haste. He pinned Vorlag, with a gaze that was no longer molten gold but frozen fire. "I gave you an order, beta," he said, his voice dropping to a near sub-zero whisper that was more terrifying than any roar. "You question my command in my own chambers, while the enemy gathers at my door?" A shiver of primal fear, the instinct of a subordinate wolf facing down a dominant alpha, finally cut through Vorlag's anger. He swallowed, his throat working. "No, my king. I only think of the pack. They will fight with more courage if their alpha leads them." "They will fight because I command it," Mehran countered, his voice absolute. "They will hold the walls because there is no other option. My strength is needed here. The enemy is not just at the gate, Vorlag. They are here for her. The timing of their attack, on this night of all nights, is no coincidence." They knew. They sensed her awakening. He took a step toward his beta, and the sheer force of his presence made the 3 powerful shifters flinch. "I will not fail her again. I will not be 100 miles away while they put their silver knives to her throat." Now go. Defend our home. I will defend its heart." The finality in his tone was unarguable. He was the king. His word was law, even if that law seemed to defy all logic. With a final, smoldering look at Reyna, a look that promised this was not over, Vorlag bowed his head stiffly. "As you command," he bid out. He turned on his heel, his movements sharp with contained fury, and swept from the room, the other two warriors following in his wake. The heavy doors slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Reyna was left alone with him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was the cause of this. The reason a king was abandoning his post, the reason his most loyal men were looking at him with doubt and at her with murder in their eyes. The weight of it was crushing. "They'll be killed because of me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mayron turned away from the door, his attention returning to her. The warrior king receded slightly, replaced by the intense, possessive male. He walked not to her, but to the open window, his senses expanding to read the night. His head was cocked, listening to sounds she couldn't hear: the distant clash of steel, a warning horn's low moan, the shouts of his wolves organizing for battle. "My warriors are not so easily broken," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Vorlag is the finest beta I have ever known. His anger makes him reckless, but his loyalty will make him ferocious in the defense. They will hold." He seemed so certain, so calm. It was the calm of a creature who had seen 100 battles, who understood the calculus of war in his very bones. While her world was ending, his was simply proceeding as it always had, with violence and the threat of death. He turned from the window, his golden eyes scanning the room, assessing its weaknesses, its defensive points. He was a predator in his den, ensuring its security. He nudged a heavy wooden chest with his foot, moving it closer to the door to act as a secondary barricade. He checked the firmness of the iron hinges. His movements were economical, purposeful, and utterly captivating. He was not just a king who gave orders. He was a warrior preparing his ground. Reyna watched him, mesmerized. A strange, unfamiliar feeling was unfurling in her chest, pushing past the fear. It was a nascent sense of security. In her human life, she had always been the one to lock the doors, to check the windows, to live with a low hum of anxiety about the dangers of the world. Now, in the heart of the most dangerous situation she had ever faced, she was in the presence of a being who was the living embodiment of a fortress. He was the danger, and he was on her side. He finished his silent inspection, and his gaze fell upon her. She was still standing in the middle of the room, small and fragile in her simple cotton nightgown, her arms wrapped around herself. He saw the tremor in her hands, the pallor of her skin. With a low sigh, he crossed the room to the massive bed and pulled a heavy fur from it, the pelt of some great, dark beast, thick and soft. He walked back to her and, without a word, draped it over her shoulders. The weight was startling, a heavy, comforting pressure. The fur was imbued with his scent pine and that wild, musky smell, and it enveloped her in a cocoon of surprising warmth. Her shivering began to subside. "You are in shock," he stated, his voice now devoid of anger, holding only a clinical concern. "Sit." He guided her back to the chair and she sank into it, pulling the fur tighter around herself. He remained standing before her, a looming, protective mountain. His eyes scanned her face, then drifted down, and a slight frown creased his brow. "You're bleeding," he said. Reyna looked down. She hadn't even noticed. A thin, shallow scratch ran along her forearm, beaded with a few drops of blood, a memento from when he had first pulled her through the doorway of her cottage. It was nothing, a tiny, insignificant wound. Before she could dismiss it, he knelt in front of her again. He took her arm, his grip firm but gentle, and lifted it to inspect the cut. His calloused thumb brushed away a smear of blood, the touch sending a jolt of heat straight to her core. "It is a small thing," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "but their silver is often poisoned. We must be certain." He lowered his head. Reyna's breath hitched. She thought he was going to kiss the wound, a gesture from some half-forgotten storybook, but he did something far more primal, far more shocking. He touched the tip of his tongue to the tiny cut. A bolt of pure, unadulterated lightning shot through her. It was not a sexual touch, yet it was the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. She could feel the slight roughness of his tongue, the searing heat of his mouth. A low groan escaped her lips without her permission. The humming in her blood, the call of the wolf within, exploded into a roaring inferno. It was a feeling of rightness, of completion. So profound it brought tears to her eyes. He lifted his head, his golden eyes dark, turbulent pools of emotion. He had felt it too, the nascent spark of the bond flaring between them. He could taste her life force, her very soul on his tongue, and it was the taste of home. A faint flicker of light, a pale silver glow, emanated from the scratch. It was not from him, but from her. The wound was closing, the skin knitting itself back together before her very eyes, leaving no trace it had ever been there. She stared, speechless, her mind refusing to comprehend. "You see?" he whispered, his voice thick with a triumphant reverence. "The healing. It begins. My presence, our proximity, it is already waking you up." He didn't release her arm. His thumb stroked the newly healed skin, sending tremors through her. His gaze held hers, intense and possessive. The sounds of the distant battle faded into a dull, meaningless roar. The world had shrunk to the space between their faces, the charged air crackling with an energy that was both ancient and terrifyingly new. "This," he murmured, his eyes dropping once more to her lips, "is why they are afraid. This is the power they tried to destroy, the power of a king and queen, united, a power that can heal, that can create, and that can annihilate our enemies." He leaned in, and this time, nothing was going to stop him. This was not a gentle exploration, it was a claiming. His mouth descended on hers, and the world exploded into pure sensation. His lips were firm, demanding, yet unbelievably soft against her own. The kiss was not one of passion, not yet, but of a desperate, soul-deep hunger. It was the kiss of a starving man finally tasting bread, of a dying man drinking water. He was tasting a memory, reclaiming a piece of his own soul that had been lost for 200 agonizing years. Raina's mind went blank. All thought, all fear, all resistance was incinerated in the sheer, overwhelming power of the kiss. Her human self, the quiet, lonely girl from the cottage, dissolved like mist in the sun. Something else rose in her place, something older, fiercer. The wolf inside her surged forward, not with a snarl, but with a cry of joyous, agonizing recognition. "Mine," it howled in the depths of her soul. "Mate, king, mine." Her hands, of their own accord, came up and tangled in his long, dark hair, pulling him closer. She kissed him back, a desperate, clumsy, innocent response to his centuries of expertise and longing. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, possessive pleasure, and he deepened the kiss, his tongue tracing the seam of her lips, a silent, demanding question. A deafening crash from outside the chamber shattered the moment. It was closer this time, the sound of splintering wood and a triumphant, human roar, followed by the shriek of a wolf in pain. Mehran tore his mouth from hers, a snarl ripping from his throat. The lover was gone, and the warrior king was back in his place, his eyes blazing with murderous fury. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, pulling her up with him. "They're on this level," he growled, pushing her behind him, shielding her with his body. "The western post has fallen." He strode to the mantel and his hand closed around the hilt of the ornate silver dagger, the weapon from her vision. He turned, the blade gleaming with cold malice in the moonlight. Raina flinched, the phantom memory of holding it, of using it, washing over her. But he didn't point it at himself. He strode back to her and pressed the hilt firmly into her hand. Her fingers closed around it instinctively. It was cold, unnaturally so, and it seemed to thrum with a faint, dark energy. "What?" she whispered, staring at the weapon in horror. "Vorlag was right about one thing," Mehran said, his voice a low, deadly rasp as he backed toward the door, his eyes fixed on the entrance. "I cannot be in two places at once." He placed his hand on the heavy iron bolt. "If they get through that door, if they get past me, you will not let them take you. You will not let them perform their ritual again. Do you understand?" He was giving her the means to her own end, the ultimate escape. But it was also something more. It was a test. It was a symbol of the very betrayal she had seen in her vision. He was placing his past, his future, and the ghost of his greatest wound directly into her hands. He drew the bolt. "Stay away from the door," he commanded. And then he was gone, pulling the great doors shut behind him. The heavy thud of a crossbar falling into place on the outside echoed in the room, sealing her in. Raina was left, standing alone in the vast, moonlit chamber. The sounds of a desperate, savage battle raged just outside the door, the clang of steel on steel, the snarls of wolves, the shouts of men, and in her trembling hand, she held the silver dagger that had, in another life, ended it all. The world outside the chamber doors became a symphony of hell. Reyna stood frozen, a statue carved from ice and fear, the cold, malevolent weight of the silver dagger in her hand, a terrifying anchor to reality. The heavy fur pelt lay forgotten at her feet. Every sound from the hallway was magnified. Each clang of metal a physical blow, each pained snarl a knife twist in her gut. She could distinguish Mehron's roars from the others, deeper, louder, filled with a righteous fury that was less a sound of battle and more a force of nature. It was the sound of a storm breaking, of an earthquake tearing the world apart. She could hear the shouts of the hunters, their voices sharp and clipped, barking orders in a language she didn't understand. But the intent was universal: kill, destroy, eradicate. She heard the wet, sickening sound of blades finding flesh, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the stone floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the sounds imprinted themselves on her mind, painting a vivid, gruesome tapestry of the violence being enacted just a few feet away. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the dagger. "You will not let them take you." His final command echoed in her ears. He had given her a choice, an escape, but it felt like a curse. Could she do it? Could she plunge that blade into her own heart to prevent some unknown horrific ritual from being performed on her again? The very thought made her stomach clench with a nausea so profound she swayed on her feet. Her human instincts screamed for survival, for life at any cost. But the other part of her, the nascent wolf that had awoken at his touch, understood his command on a deeper, more primal level. Capture was worse than death. Defilement of the soul was a fate from which there was no return. A sudden, piercing shriek of agony cut through the din, a wolf's cry, high and sharp, followed by a triumphant human yell. Reyna's eyes flew open. They were winning. The hunters were winning. The thought sent a jolt of pure, undiluted terror through her. If they got through the door, if they got past Mehron. Her gaze darted around the room, a frantic search for an escape that didn't exist. The open window was a sheer, 100-foot drop onto jagged rock. The only way out was through the battle. She was trapped, a queen in a tower, waiting for her fate to be decided by the clashing of swords outside her door. The sounds of the fight were changing, moving. They were growing more desperate, drawing closer to the chamber doors. Mehron's roars were more ragged now, laced with pain. She heard a heavy, crunching impact against the wood, making the entire doorframe shudder. They were trying to break it down. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through her paralysis. She couldn't just stand here and wait to be slaughtered or captured. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide, the dagger held out in front of her in a trembling, useless guard. Another tremendous crash shook the doors, and a crack appeared in the thick oak, splintering from the center. A sliver of torchlight from the hallway pierced the darkness of the room. They were using a battering ram, or something like it. "He is in there," a man's voice shouted from the other side, hoarse with effort. "With the vessel. Break it down." The vessel. That's all she was to them. Not a person, not a queen. A thing to be captured, used, and discarded. The cold, impersonal word solidified a resolve in her she didn't know she possessed. She would not be their vessel. She would not be their prize. With a choked sob, she turned the dagger in her hand, the point aimed at her own chest. Her hand was shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. She closed her eyes, her mind a maelstrom of terror and a strange, unfamiliar sense of duty. She thought of Mehron, of his centuries of grief, of the desperate hope in his eyes when he'd kissed her. Her death would be his final, ultimate failure. The thought was more painful than the idea of the blade itself. But what other choice did she have? Just as she tensed her arm to plunge the blade home, a different sound cut through the chaos. A low, resonant hum. It started quietly, a vibration in the stone floor, but it grew rapidly in intensity, a deep, harmonic thrum that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the mountain. The battering outside the door stopped. The shouting ceased. The entire battle seemed to fall silent, holding its breath. The hum grew louder, making the air in the room feel thick, heavy, charged with a strange, ancient power. A soft blue light began to emanate from the walls of the chamber. It wasn't the light of a torch or the moon, but something else entirely. It was a gentle, ethereal glow that seeped from the very stones themselves, as if the mountain keep were waking from a long slumber. Faint, intricate lines of silver, invisible moments before, began to trace their way across the stone blocks, forming complex patterns and ancient runes. They pulsed with the humming sound, a network of luminous, magical veins. Reyna stared, her hand frozen in its deadly purpose. The dagger forgotten. This was magic. Real magic. The kind Meron had spoken of. The wards! The wards are active! A voice screamed from the hallway, laced with panic. The heart of the keep is awakening. Fall back! Fall back now! There was a sudden scramble of retreating footsteps, cries of alarm, and the sound of Meron letting out a final, triumphant, pain-filled roar. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence that was even more unnerving than the battle had been. The blue light in the chamber slowly faded, the silver runes disappearing back into the stone, and the deep hum subsided, leaving only the echo of its power behind. Reyna stood trembling in the center of the room, the dagger still clutched in her hand, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The keep, it had defended itself. It had defended her. A moment later, she heard the heavy crossbar being lifted from the outside of the door. The latch clicked, and one of the great doors groaned open just enough for a figure to stumble through. It was Meron. He was a nightmare of blood and fury. His dark clothing was slashed and torn, soaked through in places with his own dark blood. A deep gash ran along his ribs on his left side, and another, shallower cut bled freely from his shoulder. His face was grim, splattered with gore that was not his own, his golden eyes blazing with the feral light of the battle's aftermath. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his breathing coming in ragged, painful gasps. But he was alive, and he was victorious. His gaze found her immediately, and the first thing he saw was the dagger in her hand, its point still aimed at her heart. A storm of emotions crossed his face, relief, fury, and a profound, heart-stopping tenderness. "You didn't use it," he rasped, his voice raw. Reyna could only shake her head, the words caught in her throat. The sight of him, so powerful and yet so wounded, shattered the last of her composure. A sob escaped her, and the dagger clattered from her numb fingers onto the stone floor. He pushed himself off the doorframe and limped toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't stop until he was standing before her, his large frame swaying with exhaustion and pain. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice a low growl, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently brushing away the tears that now streamed down her cheeks. "No," she whispered. "But you're hurt." A grim smile touched his lips. "They paid a higher price," he gestured, with his head back toward the hallway. "They will not trouble us again tonight." He swayed again, a wave of dizziness washing over him, and his grip on her face tightened as he fought to stay upright. The gash on his side was bleeding more heavily now, a sluggish, dark river staining the remnants of his tunic. You need a doctor," she said, her human instincts taking over. He let out a short, harsh laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "My pack has healers, but none can enter this chamber now. The keep has sealed it. It recognized you as its queen, and the threat to your life. It awoke the old wards. It will not allow anyone else to enter until the blood moon sets, and it deems the threat has passed. Then, we're trapped in here?" "We are safe in here," he corrected, his gaze intense. "Alone." The word hung in the air between them, charged with 1,000 unspoken possibilities. The battle was over, but the war for her soul was just beginning. He was wounded, vulnerable in a way she had not yet seen, and they were locked together in the heart of his power until dawn. She reached out a hesitant hand and pressed it gently against the gash on his ribs. He hissed in pain, his muscles clenching under her touch, but he didn't pull away. The fabric of his tunic was sticky and wet. "This is bad," she said, her voice soft with a concern that surprised her. "It needs to be cleaned." He watched her, his golden eyes dark and unreadable. He had fought a dozen men to protect her. He had commanded his pack and his ancient, magical fortress, and now he was bleeding at her feet, and she was the only one who could help him. The power dynamic had shifted in a subtle but profound way. "There is water and cloth by the wash basin," he said, his voice low. Nodding, Reyna moved to a small alcove she hadn't noticed before, where a large ceramic basin and a pitcher sat on a wooden stand. Her hands were shaking, but she moved with a newfound purpose. She poured water into the basin and grabbed a piece of clean, linen cloth. When she returned, he had managed to shrug out of the torn remnants of his tunic and had sunk down to sit on the edge of the massive bed, his back to her. Reyna's breath caught. His back was a roadmap of old battles, a tapestry of scars. Long, pale lines from blades, puckered circles from arrowheads, and one massive, jagged scar that looked like it had been caused by the claws of some enormous beast. He was a living history of violence, a creature forged in a crucible of constant warfare. And yet, here he sat, bleeding in his chambers, allowing her, the frightened human girl, to tend to his wounds. She knelt behind him and gently began to clean the gash on his shoulder. He flinched at the first touch of the cold, wet cloth, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But he held himself still, granting her his trust. As she worked, carefully wiping away the blood, and grime, a strange intimacy settled over them. There was no king, no captive, just a man and a woman, alone in a fortress, surrounded by the ghosts of a battle just ended. The wound on his shoulder was clean but deep. The one on his side was worse, a long, ugly cut that was still weeping blood. As she moved to clean it, her fingers brushed against the hot skin of his back. He shuddered at the contact, a tremor that ran through his entire powerful frame. Slowly, he turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. The fire of battle was gone from his eyes, replaced by that deep, ancient longing, now mixed with a raw, startling vulnerability. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. She had a healer's touch. The pack always said her hands could soothe the fire of any wound. This time, the comparison didn't anger her. It felt different. Not a judgment, but a memory, soft and sad, a plea. She finished cleaning the wound as best she could. It would need stitching, but that was a skill she did not possess. All she could do was press a clean cloth against it, trying to staunch the bleeding. She moved to kneel in front of him, her hand still pressed to his side. They were so close now, their knees almost touching. "Why did you give me the dagger?" she asked softly, the question that had been burning in her mind. His gaze fell to the blade, still lying on the floor where she had dropped it. A look of immense pain crossed his face. "Because the last time," he said, his voice rough, "the last time, she had no choice. They took it from her. I would not let that happen again. The choice, at least, the choice had to be yours." He looked back at her, and his eyes were glistening with an emotion so powerful it stole the air from her lungs. It was gratitude. It was awe. It was the look of a man who had just been given back the one thing he thought he had lost forever. Hope. He reached up and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her. "Cheek, you held the blade that betrayed our love," he murmured. "And you chose me. You chose us." And in that moment, Raina knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the vision had been a lie, a trick of magic and memory, because the soul of the man kneeling before her, the king who would rather die than leave her defenseless, was not the soul of a man she could ever have betrayed. He leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers, his eyes closed. "The healing," he whispered, a desperate prayer. "It begins now. Heal with me, Raina. Wake up with me." His words were not a command, but an invitation, a plea from a soul that had been wandering in darkness for 200 years, finally finding its star. Heal with me. Wake up with me. Raina's own soul, the frightened, fluttering bird in the cage of her ribs, heard the call and answered. A tremor went through her, not of fear, but of profound, terrifying release. It felt like the moment before a plunge into deep water, a surrender to a current far more powerful than herself. His forehead was hot against hers, his breathing still labored from pain and exhaustion. Her hands were still pressed to the wound on his side, and she could feel the steady, sluggish seep of his lifeblood against the cloth. He was so incredibly vulnerable in that moment, the Alpha King stripped of all his armor, his life literally in her hands. The trust he was placing in her was a weight and a gift, a burden and a blessing. She closed her eyes, shutting out the moonlit chamber, the blood, the aftermath of the battle. She focused on the point of contact between them, his skin against hers, his breath on her lips, the solid, living presence of him. She remembered the jolt of his kiss, the taste of him on her tongue, the way the wolf inside her had howled in recognition. And she remembered the vision, the dagger, the blood, the lie. A flicker of anger, cold and sharp, ignited within her. Anger at the witches who had done this, who had twisted love into betrayal and cursed a queen to a half-life of fear and forgetting. They had not just stolen Lyra's life, they had tried to poison her memory, to defile her very essence. They had tried to turn her into a weapon against the one being she was born to love. They lied, she whispered, the words a discovery and a vow. The vision, it wasn't my memory. It was theirs. It was the curse they wanted me to believe. Maron's breath hitched. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own golden gaze searching hers, blazing with a desperate, dawning hope. "You are sure?" "I am," she said, and the certainty came from a place deeper than thought, a place of pure instinct. To hurt you. It would be like tearing out my own heart. The last of the ice in his eyes finally shattered, washed away by a tidal wave of relief so powerful it was devastating to witness. The king who had faced down an army, who had bent his entire pack to his will, looked at her with the raw, unguarded eyes of a man who had just been pulled from the gallows. A low sound, half groan, half sob, was torn from his chest. He surged forward, his mouth finding hers again, but this kiss was different. It was not the desperate reclaiming of a memory, but a celebration. It was a kiss of gratitude, of fierce, triumphant joy. It was frantic and messy and wet with her tears and his, a desperate affirmation of a truth they had both nearly lost. He poured all of his 200 years of loneliness, of grief, of hope, into that kiss. He poured his strength, his power, his very soul into her, and Reyna, the girl who had been afraid of her own shadow, met him with an equal, startling ferocity. She was no longer just a vessel receiving his energy. She was a participant, a mirror, a conduit. The humming started again. Not from the stones this time, but from within her. It was the frantic, frantic hum she had felt in her blood for years. But now it was no longer a sign of anxiety. It was a gathering of power. The sleeping wolf, nudged awake by his proximity, jolted by his kiss, was now rising, shaking off the enchanted slumber of 2 centuries. A wave of heat, intense and searing, washed through her body. It started in her chest, where his kiss was breathing life into her, and spread like wildfire through her limbs. It was a pain that was also a pleasure, an agony that was also an ecstasy. It was the feeling of cramped muscles stretching after ages of confinement, of a soul unfurling its wings for the first time. She gasped against his mouth, her back arching, her hands clenching on his wounded side. He growled, a sound of both pain and encouragement, and deepened the kiss, driving her further, urging her on. He knew what was happening. He was her anchor in the storm, the lighthouse calling her to shore. The world behind her closed eyelids dissolved into a maelstrom of fractured images and sensations. She felt the cold forest floor against her skin, smelled the damp earth and crushed pine. She saw molten gold eyes, not from the outside, but as a reflection of her own. She felt the power of strong limbs, the satisfying crunch of leaves under powerful paws. A howl, wild and free, tore through her memory, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. A name echoed in the chaos. Lyra, not a ghost's name, but her own. "I am Lyra." The thought was a lightning strike, a revelation that burned away 20 years of lies in a single brilliant flash. I am Lyra, and I am Reyna. I am both. She was not a replacement. She was not a vessel. She was a continuation. The soul was the same, but the life had made her new. She was the queen reborn, forged in the quiet solitude of a human life, tempered by a loneliness that mirrored his own. She had been incomplete, and now she was being made whole. With a final, shattering cry that was lost in his mouth, the dam broke. Power, raw and untamed, flooded her. It was a tidal wave, a hurricane, a supernova. It was too much for her human form to contain. Her bones felt as if they were dissolving, her muscles twisting and reforming. The pain was excruciating, absolute, but somewhere beneath it, the wolf rejoiced. This was not a death, it was a birth. She tore her mouth from his, a scream of pure, animalistic agony and release ripping from her throat. Her body convulsed, and she fell back onto the furs of the massive bed, thrashing as the transformation, the awakening he had spoken of, took her. Maron was there, his hands on her shoulders, holding her steady, his voice a low, calming rumble in her ear, murmuring ancient words in the shifter tongue. He was her rock, her guide through the crucible of her rebirth. He was not afraid of her pain. He was welcoming it, embracing it as a sign of her return. Her vision blurred, the room dissolving into shapes and colors. The scent of him, of his blood, of the cold stone and the wild night, filled her senses, amplified 1,000 times over. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, the slower, pained rhythm of his. She could feel the cool draft from the window on one side of her face and the heat radiating from his body on the other. Her senses were on fire. The pain crested, a wave of liquid fire that threatened to consume her. She felt a sharp cracking sensation in her bones, a feeling of being torn apart and remade from the inside out. Her scream turned into a guttural snarl. Her nails dug into the furs, and she felt them elongate, thicken, sharpen into claws. The world turned red, the color of the blood moon, the color of his blood, the color of her rage and her becoming. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The pain receded, leaving behind a profound, humming stillness. A sense of power so immense it was dizzying settled into her limbs. She lay panting on the furs, her body trembling with the aftershocks. The world slowly swam back into focus. She looked at her. Hands. They were her hands, but different, stronger. Her nails were slightly longer, harder, with the faint, pearlescent curve of talons. She took a breath, and her lungs seemed to expand further than they ever had before, drawing in the rich tapestry of scents in the room with a new, startling clarity. She could smell the fear on the wind from the defeated hunters, the loyalty of the pack below, the ancient magic in the stones. And Marin, his scent was a symphony of strength, pain, and a love so profound it was a physical presence in the room. Slowly, she sat up. The fur pelt slid from her shoulders. She felt solid, rooted. For the first time in her life, she felt completely, utterly at home in her own skin. The disconnect, the haunting exhaustion, was gone. In its place was a wellspring of vibrant, ferocious energy. She looked at Maron. He was kneeling by the bed, watching her, his golden eyes wide with awe and adoration. The wounds on his body seemed insignificant compared to the raw, naked hope on his face. "Lyra," he breathed, the name a prayer. She smiled, and it was not the hesitant, shy smile of Reyna Solon. It was a slow, confident, predatory smile that belonged to a queen. "Reyna," she corrected him softly. "My name is Reyna, because Lyra was the past, a memory to be honored. Reyna was the present, the woman who had survived the curse, who had found her way back to him through a lifetime of quiet desperation." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He nodded, a look of profound respect on his face. "Reyna," he repeated, and her name on his lips was a coronation. She reached out and gently touched the gash on his side. "You are hurt, my king." Her voice was different, deeper, more resonant, with a core of steel it had never possessed before. He looked down at his wound, then back at her. A slow smile spread across his own face. "The healing begins now," he murmured, echoing her own thoughts, echoing his own plea from moments before. She leaned forward, her new senses guiding her. She knew, with an instinct as old as the mountains, what she had to do. She lowered her head and, just as he had done for her, she touched her tongue to his wound. The jolt was electric, a circuit completed. Power flowed from her into him, not the wild, chaotic power of her transformation, but a focused, gentle, healing energy. A soft golden light, the color of her reawakened soul, bloomed under her touch. She could feel his tissues knitting back together, his pain receding, his strength returning. She was not just taking his strength anymore. She was giving back her own. They were two halves of a whole, healing each other, completing each other. He gasped, his head falling back, his hands gripping the furs on either side of him. The healing was an intense, ecstatic process, a physical manifestation of their bond reforming, stronger than it had ever been. When she pulled back, the wound was gone. The skin was smooth and unmarred, save for the faint silver tracery of a new scar. A testament to the battle he had fought for her, a mark of her return. He looked down at his side, then back at her, his eyes blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with a desire that had been denied for 2 centuries. "My queen," he growled, his voice a low, possessive rumble. He reached for her, his hands tangling in her hair, and pulled her down onto the bed, onto the furs, his powerful body covering hers. The blood moon shone through the window, bathing them in its crimson light. The awakening was over. The joining was about to begin. The first snows of winter had come to the Blackwood. They fell not in a blizzard, but in a soft, reverent hush, each flake a tiny ghost kissing the dark pines and ancient stones of the keep. Reyna stood on the high stone balcony of the Queen's chambers, her chambers now, and watched the valley slowly turn from green and gray to purest white. The air was sharp and clean, so cold it should have burned her lungs, but it didn't. She drew it in deeply, and it felt like a draught of pure life, every scent a story. The wood smoke from the hearths below, the metallic tang of the coming ice, the rich, loamy scent of the earth preparing for its long sleep. 3 moons had passed since the night of blood and awakening. 3 moons of learning, of healing, of becoming. The girl who had trembled in a lonely cottage was a faint, distant memory, a character from a book she had once read. She felt a fond, gentle pity for that girl, but she did not miss her. That girl had been a whisper, a shadow. Reyna, now, was a voice. She was a presence. A heavy tread on the stone behind her did not make her flinch. She knew the weight of every warrior's footfall in this keep, the sound of their loyalty. "My queen," she turned. Vorlag stood a respectful distance away, his head bowed slightly. The open defiance in his silver eyes was long gone, replaced by a hard-won, grudging respect that, in a wolf as proud as he, was worth more than 1,000 vows of fealty. In the weeks following the battle, he had watched her. He had tested her with subtle questions about pack law, with strategic problems regarding the patrols, and she, guided by the instincts of Lyra and the quiet, observant nature of Reyna, had answered him with a wisdom that had slowly, surely, won him over. "Vorlag," she acknowledged, her voice calm and steady. "What news from the eastern patrols?" "The last of the Argent Hand's encampments has been abandoned," he reported, his tone clipped and professional. "They have fled our lands entirely. The new wards you helped the king weave along the ridges are holding. Nothing has passed them, not so much as a field mouse, without our knowing." She nodded, a flicker of satisfaction warming her. In the aftermath, she had discovered that her connection to Meron gave her a unique ability to sense the magic of the Meron Anafe land, to see the ley lines he commanded. Together, they had spent weeks walking the borders of their territory, reinforcing the ancient protections, braiding his raw power with her intuitive grace to create a shield stronger than stone. "Good," she said. "Keep the sentries vigilant. Their fear will curdle into hatred. They will return one day." "We will be ready for them," he stated. And for the first time, she heard the conviction in his voice that the word "we" truly included her. He bowed again, a deeper, more genuine gesture this time, and retreated, his footsteps fading into the silence of the keep. Reyna turned back to the falling snow. She was not Lyra's ghost. She was the culmination of a promise. Lyra's memories and instincts were a deep, powerful river that flowed within her. But the banks of that river, the course it took, were shaped by Reyna's own life. Lyra's soul gave her the strength of a queen, but it was Reyna's quiet compassion, her memory, of what it was to be small and afraid, that allowed her to rule with a wisdom that even Vorlag could not deny. A familiar scent, the one that was now as essential to her as the air she breathed, preceded him. Meron stepped onto the balcony, moving with a silence that still astonished her. The wounds from that night had left faint, silvery scars on his skin, marks she now traced with her fingertips in the quiet hours before dawn. They were not reminders of his pain, but symbols of their victory. He came to stand behind her, his large, warm body a perfect shield against the winter chill. His arms wrapped around her waist, and he pulled her back against his chest, his chin coming to rest atop her head. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the snow blanket their world. They did not need words. The steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back, the thrum of their completed bond, said everything. "You are not cold?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble. Against her ear, "I don't think I will ever be cold again," she answered truthfully. The fire he had awakened in her was a constant, steady flame, a core of warmth that defied any winter. He tightened his hold, his hand spreading possessively over her stomach. "Vorlag seems to have finally accepted that I did not lose my mind." A small smile touched her lips. "He has accepted that his queen has a better strategic mind than he does. It wounds his pride, but he will recover." Meron chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated through her. It was a sound she had come to cherish, a sound that had been absent from his life for far too long. He was still a fierce, formidable king, but the crushing weight of grief had been lifted. The sorrow in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, abiding peace, and a possessive, ever-present fire that was reserved only for her. "The echoes of Lyra are quiet today," he observed softly. It was a question he asked often, always gentle, always careful. They are not echoes, she said, turning in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his harsh, beloved face. They are part of the song, my song. She looked into his molten gold eyes, the eyes that had haunted her dreams and then saved her reality. Thank you for not giving up on her, and thank you for finding me. The raw emotion that flooded his face still had the power to steal her breath. He saw her, not a memory, not a soul in a cage, but her, Reyna, his queen, his mate. Always. He whispered, his voice thick with the weight of 200 years of devotion. Across 1,000 lifetimes, I would always find you. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of their reunion, nor the fiery kiss of their joining. It was a kiss of profound, unshakable certainty. It was the kiss of forever. It spoke of shared dawns and quiet evenings, of leading their pack together, of the long, beautiful, endless stretch of years that now lay before them. It was a kiss that sealed a vow made in another life and finally fulfilled in this one. When he lifted his head, a single, perfect snowflake landed on her eyelash. He brushed it away with a calloused thumb, his touch infinitely tender. An eternity, he murmured, a promise against her lips. They tried to steal it from us. Reyna smiled, a true, radiant smile that made his heart thunder in his chest. She pressed her forehead to his, the king and queen, the wolf and his soul, finally whole. The snow fell around them, cloaking the world in a pristine, silent peace. The echoes of the past had settled. The ghosts were at rest, and in the heart of the ancient mountains, under the silver watch of the moon, their eternity had finally, truly begun.